Welcome to your ultimate pit stop, Piston Pundit. President Trump's sudden move to double steel and aluminum tariffs to 50% triggered an industrial shockwave still reverberating today. By August 1st, a 35% tariff on Canadian exports outside USMCA pushed tensions into full-blown trade war territory. Canada struck back. Prime Minister Mark Carney slammed the door, rerouting steel to Europe and Asia and unleashing clean tech investment at home. Detroit's factories froze. Alberta sealed its supply lines. This isn't just about metal, it's a seismic shift in power, trade, and auto manufacturing across North America. Tariffs to turmoil, when protection backfires. What started as a bold move to revive U.S. industry quickly spiraled into disruption. Earlier this summer, President Trump doubled tariffs on imported steel and aluminum to 50%, citing Canada's failure to curb fentanyl trafficking, a claim Prime Minister Carney dismissed as disconnected from reality. The market response was immediate. Nucor raised hot-rolled coil prices to $900 per ton, a $150 jump in 2 weeks. U.S. automakers like Ford, GM, and Stellantis were blindsided. With each F-150 requiring a ton of steel and Canada supplying up to 12 million tons annually, Detroit's steel pipeline snapped overnight. Canadian steel orders dried up. Rail shipments halted. By mid-July, Ford's River Rouge plant idled 2 stamping lines. The S&P 500 dipped 0.75%, with traders calling it Trump's metal recession teaser. In Windsor, Ontario, anxiety surged. Fourth-gen Ford worker Kristen Lawton called it life-changing fear. Michigan's unemployment hit 5.4%, the nation's highest. Meanwhile, Canada's furnaces roared in Hamilton as Ottawa pivoted from supplier to gatekeeper, leaving Motor City scrambling. But this wasn't just an economic freeze, it was the start of a calculated pivot. And Canada's next move was just as bold. Carney's steel gambit, clean tech meets cold strategy. If Trump's tariff was a show of force, Carney's reply was precision strategy. Within 48 hours, Canada launched a $1 billion initiative to decarbonize its steel belt, replacing coal-fired furnaces with electric arc and hydrogen-powered systems. But this was more than clean energy. It was geopolitical chess. On July 16th, Canada imposed steep quotas on steel from non-FTA nations and hit Chinese origin steel with a flat 25% duty. The message: Canada would no longer be a dumping ground. At home, Carney pledged to reserve Canadian-made steel for domestic infrastructure, housing, pipelines, and transit, ensuring public funds fueled Canadian jobs. With hydro and nuclear powering its mills, Canada turned clean energy into a trade advantage. The pivot paid off. European buyers, preparing for the EU's 2026 Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, rushed in. Canadian steel, 93% emissions-free, qualified for CBAM exemption, unlocking higher prices and faster exports. Carney summed it up. This is no longer about protectionism. This is about positioning. Just like that, the trade war became a clean tech arms race. And as Canada surged forward, Detroit was already losing ground. Enjoying the insights? Hit that like button and subscribe to Piston Pundit for deep dives into global auto dynamics, trade politics, and powertrain pivots. Now let's roll into what happened next on U.S. soil. Detroit's slide, outpriced, outpaced, and outmaneuvered. Back home, U.S. automakers weren't just facing a steel shortage, they were hemorrhaging cash. Ford CEO Jim Farley warned Congress the 50% tariff would cost $2.5 billion this year. With each F-Series requiring a ton of steel at $900, Ford was bleeding 6 figures every few minutes. Dealerships scrambled, prices on popular models jumped $1,500 to $2,000. Mexico-built vehicles saw hikes as high as 25%, squeezing consumers nationwide. But the impact spread further. Texas oil drillers ran out of pipe as Canada redirected its supply domestically. Enbridge resorted to cannibalizing old stock just to keep projects moving. Smaller contractors were frozen out entirely. Congress rushed to intervene. On July 21st, senators pleaded with Carney in Ottawa to lift what they dubbed the the metal blockade. He refused, offering only limited quotas. His message was clear: cooperate or pay. Canada didn't retaliate with tariffs. It offered better alternatives. Europe embraced its cleaner steel, while Detroit, bound by cost and chaos, fell behind. That global appetite for Canadian steel wasn't accidental. It was part of a much broader realignment in trade, and Canada was steering the wheel. The global pivot, Canada, rewrites the steel map. Once seen as America's junior industrial partner, Ottawa now writes its own script. Backed by Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Prime Minister Carney's moves were more than defense. They became long-term strategy. A nationwide made-in-Canada mandate now requires all federally funded infrastructure, roads, rail, housing, to use domestic steel. Provinces like Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan followed suit, mandating Ontario melted steel for pipelines, down to spurs and valves. Canada's export focus also shifted. Steel shipments to the U.S. fell from 75% to 68% by May 2025. Manufacturers expanded trade with the EU, Japan, and India, boosted by CBAM-friendly emissions credentials. Crucially, Canada didn't violate USMCA. Most exports still comply, but for non-FTA buyers and raw materials, the gate is closing. The result? Canada now bypasses U.S. customs, loops through global markets, and books contracts through 2027. Even as U.S. prices dipped in July, Canada held the advantage: volume, emissions, and alignment. Trump called it protectionism. Carney simply calls it smart positioning. But while Canada moved strategically, workers on both sides of the border felt the brunt in very real, very personal ways. Factory floor fallout, jobs, fear, and fractures. Beyond boardrooms, the trade war is hitting workers where it hurts. In Windsor, Canada's Motor City, auto workers are reliving the trauma of 2008. Kristen Lawton, a fourth-generation Ford employee, says her plant feels like a powder keg. Her entire family works in the auto sector, and now everything feels at risk. Manufacturing makes up 19% of Windsor's workforce. Tariffs on steel and parts have already triggered layoffs, frozen expansion, and rattled suppliers. Across Canada, 500,000 jobs are tied to US-bound exports. As orders stopped, the slowdown spread. Hamilton's mills to London's welders. Union leaders warn that younger workers are especially vulnerable. US plants relying on Canadian steel now face furloughs too. Trump's 35% tariff, based on shaky fentanyl claims, has fractured labor unity across the border. Canada is pivoting. Exports to the US dropped 10 points as manufacturers eye Asia and Europe. But for towns built on cross-border trade, the shift feels like economic whiplash. The emotional toll? Families now question careers, housing, and futures, all sparked by one policy swing. And that brings us to the final twist, because this wasn't just an economic battle. It was a test of long-term vision. Verdict: steel strategy or steel trap? This trade war was never just about steel. It was about leverage, legitimacy, and long-term vision. Trump's tariff blitz aimed to shield American jobs, but it gave Canada a rare opening. With cleaner production, export realignment, and geopolitical foresight, Carney's strategy left Washington scrambling. Today, U.S. automakers face twin threats: material shortages and looming carbon tolls in Europe. The once seamless pipeline between Windsor and Detroit now hits a tariff wall, while Canadian steel glides into CBAM-compliant ports without penalty. Ottawa didn't retaliate with noise, it responded with structure. So we turn the questions to you. Should the U.S. double down on protectionism, or pivot to a cleaner, more competitive model? Can Detroit catch up before long-term damage sets in? And do tariffs actually help workers, or just shift the pain somewhere else? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Piston Pundit for the latest vehicle updates, industry breakdowns, and global trade shifts that shape the road ahead. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. You can now check out any of the videos on the screen. There's plenty more to explore.